Thank you for joining in tonight and being part of the live stream. Just glad to do this every week. Just really enjoy teaching class. I know we mentioned to you that there is some new curriculum that's coming up that we're going to start the 1st of June. It's designed a little differently than this. It really won't be like a live stream. It will be something that we send out to you. So want to make sure that you're aware of that. But we played a promotional video on Sunday morning, and because of the length of homecoming, I know that video was cut off. You didn't get to see all of it. So I want to show that to you again tonight. And this is just one little promotional video about what some of the lessons are going to be about. Again, it's only one short one. We'll have several more that are coming up as we record more of the videos. But hey, just watch this, listen to it, be entertained by it, and just look forward to what is coming soon. So let me play that for you.
How does this always happen to me?
And you guys are Clarksville Highway Youth. Are you with me?
I hope you enjoyed that. I'm really excited about that new series of studies that we're going to start in June. They're designed to kind of promote just kind of a family Bible study time. So it doesn't matter whether your family includes kids or doesn't include kids, or if you're adults in the house without kids anymore, or you have little kids. We're going to try to design that so it just meets all types of age groups. So really looking forward to that, and hope you enjoyed that. So, but tonight, we're going to continue the study we have been doing on paradoxical teachings of Jesus. So we're looking at teachings where either Jesus or something else in Scripture really kind of flips reality upside down, so that it just seems backwards. You know, that's kind of what a paradoxical teaching is. And tonight we're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. So if you have a Bible, grab that and turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're going to be throwing the scriptures on the screen, so don't feel like you have to stop and run out and grab a Bible. But I always encourage you, if you can, whatever we study on the live stream, just grab a Bible sometimes, read that and study that for yourself, become acquainted with it. So it's 2 Corinthians 12 is this thing about strength and weakness. I want to jump off the screen a little bit so you can see that slide. So when we have strength, we actually have weakness, and when we are weak, then we are strong. And I know that sounds backwards. It sounds backwards to the world, but it is very correct in the way that God works with us in our lives. So we're going to start out 2 Corinthians chapter 12. You're probably familiar with this verse. It is a verse about Paul's vision and the thorn in the flesh that he has. So we're just going to read starting in chapter 12, verse 1, and we're going to read this section right here that I have highlighted down through verse 10. So I must go on boasting, although there is nothing to be gained, and I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man who in Christ, who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. To keep me from being conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. There's a couple of things just very quickly before we jump into the text. Most of us probably don't delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and in difficulties. And Paul says that he does, and we really need to look at that and see what that is about. And it's also interesting to me, he talks about this man who 14 years ago was called up to the third heaven. And then in verse 7, he says, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there is given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan. So I believe that in chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, when Paul's talking about this man, I think that man is Paul. And Paul is the one who was called up to paradise, that heard inexpressible things. And just think about that for a second. I guess until the writing of 2 Corinthians, he has kept that secret for 14 years. He was told not to say it, and he didn't speak about it. And it's just kind of interesting. Sometimes I wonder how long we can keep a secret, but Paul did a very good job of keeping a secret. So as we look at our study for tonight, here's kind of the overriding thought. Pop off the screen again. Weakness works for us, not against us, because of the strength of God's Spirit, which lives in us. I mean, sometimes in life we look at our weaknesses or the things that we can't do, and we start saying, well, I can't do this, and this. Well, it might be that we're relying on the wrong source of strength. Because even when Paul comes out and he starts preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, we're going to look at a couple of verses where he talks about the way that he preached and the way that he came to people. And just very quickly in the larger connection of 2 Corinthians, one thing that's happening is that Paul's ministry is being called into question. And the question is, well, is Paul really an apostle? Is he really a speaker for God? And there are some who are in that church in Corinth, and Paul addresses those here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. The NIV translates it super apostles. The greatest apostles, maybe another way to look at that. But Paul says, but I do not think I am in the least inferior to those super apostles. I may not be a trained speaker, but I do have knowledge. We have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. And there are these people in the church in Corinth at the writing of 2 Corinthians. He references here later in verse 13 right here. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, masquerading as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself masqueraded as an angel of light. It is not surprising then if his servants masquerade as servants of righteousness. Their end will be what their actions deserve. So Paul, his ministry is being called into question in this section of 2 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians chapter 12, which we were looking at earlier. Paul's defending his apostleship. But when he starts preaching, Paul doesn't come with these wise, persuasive words. We're going to look at that in 1 Corinthians. And I love the way he says it here in 2 Corinthians 11:6. I may not be a trained speaker. In other words, Paul says, look, I'm not the best speaker. That's not where my strength is. In 1 Corinthians, the first letter that he wrote to the church at Corinth, and he's talking about how he came and preached the gospel to them. Listen to what he says. He says, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. You know, what if we looked at that and we thought, okay, for our preachers, that's the same kind of delivery we're going to look for. We're going to look for people who are not trained speakers. They come in weakness and fear. They come with trembling. They're not self-confident. You know, they don't seem to have everything together. But we're going to look for those because the preaching, the message that they give is not wise and persuasive by the standards of the world. It is just a demonstration of God's power. And so in our weakness, what we find is our weakness becomes the demonstration of God's power. It's when we're weak, when we know that we can't accomplish it, we don't have the ability to do it, that we're depending entirely on God. That's when we begin to develop our strength. That's when we begin to develop our ability. So as Paul talks through this, he talks about, okay, this is the way that I came to you. This is the way that I preached to you. Even when he starts defending his ministry about the things that have happened in his life. I mean, because you look at some of Paul's ministry and you think, man, it almost looks like a failure. You know, it almost looks like it's not blessed by God when it's being blessed by God at every turn. Let me hop off the screen so you can see this section that I want you to see. He says, I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. I mean, when you look at that and you think, okay, that's the kind of ministry that Paul had, we would look at that sometimes and you would think, well, you know, you must have not have been a very good preacher, a very good man of God if all of those bad things are happening to you. But they're not bad things for Paul. They are where God has shown his incredible power that God is taking care of him. And even here in 16, go back and read this later. He talks about being a fool and just having his complete trust in God. So I think one of the things that we balance there is God balances our lives between success and failure. You know, he balances it so that we won't become too exalted in our success, and we won't think we are too good, or that all the power comes from us, or that maybe that we've arrived. And then also he will guard us so that failure won't destroy us. It will keep us humble, much like we're going to look at in 2 Corinthians with Paul. You know, to keep us from being conceited, or to keep us from thinking that we have the capability to do something. The more we trust in ourselves, the less effective we become for God. The more that we realize we cannot do something, the more effective we become for God, because we realize that the power is not coming from us. The power comes through the Spirit of God who works within us. So Paul in 2 Corinthians, he starts praying for God to take this thorn away. Now, we'll debate for from the time Paul wrote 2 Corinthians to now, and from now into the time Jesus comes, people will debate what the thorn in the flesh is. I don't know what it is. I personally think it was bad eyesight, just because he writes in one of the epistles, look with what large letters I write to you. I have no idea if that's right. It's just an opinion, right? The text never tells us exactly what this messenger from Satan, this thorn in the flesh, is. And we might look at that and think, well, if Paul had a thorn in the flesh, then God must not have been blessing him. He had the thorn in the flesh because God was blessing him. Sometimes we look at our lives and we look at a difficulty and we view it from the wrong perspective. It could be that God is using that difficulty to shape us and to mold us. There's something interesting in the text here, and I don't want to make a huge thing out of it. I just think it's kind of cool. It says, in verse 8, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. I'm just intrigued by the 3 times. When Jesus, there's just a comparison with Jesus in Gethsemane, right? When Jesus is in Gethsemane, then Jesus prays 3 times for God to take the cup from him. And here Paul prays 3 times. And I just think it's interesting. I'm not saying pray 3 times and don't worry about it anymore. It's very interesting to me that both of them prayed 3 times. But I think the most interesting thing to me is they both were submissive to God's will. Whatever God chose to do, they were okay with whatever that was. I mean, it didn't mean that all of a sudden the thorn in the flesh didn't afflict Paul or didn't hurt Paul, or he did not struggle with the thorn. I think he struggled with whatever that was until he died, or maybe until God took it away, if God took it away at some point that Paul did not reveal to us. But while he had it, Paul was looking for the good that could come from that, how it could be beneficial, and how it could help him. And, I think sometimes, put this slide up here. Robert Law wrote this. I don't remember which book it was. I don't even know that I could find it again. The purpose of prayer is not to get man's will done in heaven, but to get God's will done on earth. And I think I really think that's a very significant, incredible statement. When we think about that, and we think, okay, what is the purpose of our prayer? Is the purpose of our prayer for us to get God to do what it is that we want him to do? Or is the purpose of prayer for us to mold our hearts to the will of God, to get us more in tune with what God is doing and where God is moving? And obviously, I think the second one is the correct answer. And when you look at Paul and when you look at Jesus, both of those, when you study their lives, they were incredible men of prayer. And sometimes, even in those prayers, God has these plans that we can't understand. Now, it's normal for us to ask God to remove difficulties in our lives. I mean that is God says to cast all of our cares and our burdens on Him. That's a very normal, human, and even a very okay thing to do. It's okay for us to say, God, just like Paul prayed 3 times or Jesus prayed in Gethsemane, it's very proper for us to pray that God will remove difficulty from our lives. The thing is, we also have to be faithful enough to God to rejoice in, I don't want to say unanswered prayer. We use that term a lot. And it's not that God doesn't answer. God answers. He just doesn't give us what we want. So sometimes we use the top terminology, well, thank God for unanswered prayer. Well, it wasn't unanswered. It was just answered no. I mean, it's just like this section in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where God says, look, Paul said, I want you to take this away. And God says, no, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God knew that for Paul to be the best servant that he could possibly be, that God needed Paul to trust in him, to let God's power work in Paul's life. So yes, it's okay for us to ask, but it's also, we have to learn to rejoice in God's answer. So what happens through this process is strength becomes weakness and weakness becomes strength. And that's paradoxical because it's completely different from what the world shows us is, at least how the world wants to operate. The world wants to operate out of strength. So if you really want to take control, you be in charge and you have strength and you develop your abilities and you develop your talents. There's not anything wrong with developing your abilities and talents, right? But in God's kingdom, when the more we think that we can do it ourselves, the less God can use us. The more we realize our weaknesses and the more that we realize our inability to do something, then the more God can use us. So when Paul comes along and he talks about this, he boasts about his suffering, and you think about how God sometimes has plans for us that sometimes we just don't understand. I meant to cover this a second ago, and I kind of got away on a thought, but I want to go back to it really quick because I think it's a really neat example. So in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 48, let me move this over so I can leave myself on the screen right here for just a second. On that same day, I'm reading right here, the Lord told Moses, go up into the Abraham range to Mount Nebo in Moab across from Jericho and view Canaan, the land I'm giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. This is because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the desert of Zin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore, you will see the land only from a distance. You will not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel. When I read that passage, sometimes I stop and I try to put myself in Moses' situation. Man, God, you called me to lead the Israelites, and I did. I trusted you to go even though I made excuses. I tried to be a good leader. I interceded for the people. I did all of these things. And you look at Moses and you think, man, I made one mistake and now I'm not going to be able to go into the land of Canaan. And, I don't know that it's true. I just know that if I place myself in Moses' flesh at that moment, I think, man, I would have really been disappointed. And you think about that, you think, wow, I wonder how Moses felt about that. But this interesting thing happens because in the New Testament we see Moses again. And so it's the transfiguration, and Peter, James, and John, they go up to a high mountain with Jesus, and he's transfigured, and he appears before them. And do you remember who's there? Moses and Elijah. Moses is there. The Moses that God said, okay, look, you have to look at it from a distance. At that moment, Moses was probably disappointed when he does enter the land. When we do see him in the land of Canaan, he is on the mountain with Jesus, and that must have just been an incredible moment for him. So sometimes when we look at things and we think, man, God, this just doesn't seem fair or right, or I wish you would do something different, or we're insistent to God about maybe doing something different, although it doesn't say Moses was any of those things. God has something so much greater in mind for us, but at the moment we just can't see it. So what we find out in the text is that God makes us capable. God gives us the source of ability. God makes us competent. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, again, Paul is defending his ministry. And he says, I'm going to read in chapter 3 right here, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everybody. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such confidence as this is ours through Christ before God. And I love verse 5. Okay, this is kind of what I want you to center on. Not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. He has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Do you see where Paul says, my competence comes from God. So our ability, if you look and say, okay, man, I really want to serve God. I want to do something great for God. You're not going to find that in your own ability. You're going to find that because God makes you competent. He's going to give you that ability. And even when you think about service to the saints and this section in chapter 9, verse 8 about sowing generously and giving. And I mean, I know a lot of times we use this for contribution kind of stuff, right? You know, a lot of times I'll get a question, well, how much are you supposed to give? Are you supposed to give 10%? You're supposed to give whatever God has and you have decided in your heart to give, whether it's 5, 10, 50, I mean, it doesn't matter. It's not a number, but here's the principle, which is a great principle. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God, I mean, this is the verse, God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. And we're not just talking about that you're going to abound in money. You will abound in every good work. Well, why? Why will you abound? Because you sow generously, and it's God that causes that to happen. God makes the grace abound in you. God is the source, not you. You're not the source. So you go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, right? And Paul says, look, God, I want you to take this source of weakness away. And God said, no, I'm not going to take that away, because my power is made perfect in weakness. So listen to what Paul says after that. He says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And I want to stop and just think about that verse for just a second. You know, when you think about resting, I don't know what comes into your mind when you think about that. So I just want to, this is a Greek a lexicon, and this is I know most of you can't read this. There's some Greek people maybe who listen to this that can read this. This is a word that we translate rest. But I want you to read this definition. To take up residence, to come to reside, to come to dwell. You know, the idea here is that, let me get back to where I was going. Christ's power is going to dwell, it's going to rest, it's going to reside in me. Now, if I am weak on the outside, I mean, and if there is this thorn in the flesh that I have, then and remember, Paul said, I mean, to keep me from being conceited, right? So there's these surpassingly great revelations that Paul has had. And to keep Paul from getting conceited, because he said, well, I heard the things in paradise. And I know you're going to say, well, I haven't been to paradise. I haven't seen the things there. No, but this idea of to keep me from becoming conceited is a very real thing in our world, because when we accomplish things and we think we accomplish them by our own power or because our own ability, then we start to become conceited. And God doesn't need us to be conceited. God needs us to trust in Him. So there are times that God works in our lives, and the purpose of that work in our life is to make us more like Jesus. So God You know, when you think about how you want God to work in your life, I think we should make this our goal. I mean, if you want to pray something, and this is a difficult prayer to pray sometimes because what it means, God, I want you to work in my life to make me more like Jesus. Now, that might mean that God needs to give you a thorn so that you won't become conceited, so that you won't trust in your own ability and desire, that you'll trust in him. You know, I think when Jesus, even in his teaching, when he would say things like, I and the Father are one, I have come to do the will of my Father, you know, his words were not his own, they were the words of the Father. He knew that his power, his strength, his ability comes from the Father. So we tried to work in life in a way that we become more like Jesus. And sometimes that means difficulty. You know, in Romans chapter 5, Paul writes it this way, starting in verse 1 right here. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And not only so, listen to this, we also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope, and hope does not disappoint us. And this is why, because God has poured out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit whom he has given to us. See, our ability is not our own. Our ability comes from God. And that's why this passage is so incredible, because our weakness becomes strength because we learn not to trust in our own ability or our own power, but we learn to trust in God. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, as Paul writes this out, you know, he has this, you can read this later. I want you to see this, treasures in jars of clay. You know, Paul did not write that. We put that as a title there. But in verse 7, but we have this treasure, the treasure of the gospel, the ministry, the things that we accomplish for God. We have this treasure in jars of clay, human bodies made out of dust. They are God's work. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. The ability is not us. The ability is God's power working through us. So you look back at 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and you think about Paul and his thorn in the flesh, and you think, well, what do we understand from that? Well, it was a messenger from Satan, because that's what he calls it. It was a messenger from Satan to torment me, and there was given me. And you wonder, okay, who gave it to him? God. And however you view that, I think one of the things you have to be very honest about is he recognized the thorn as a gift. He recognized that even though he wanted God to take the thorn away, to take away whatever it was, he did recognize that it was necessary to keep him from being conceited. It was necessary to keep him in check. And sometimes we look at difficulties in life, or we look at things that don't go exactly the way that we want to go, look at other things, and we have to realize sometimes those might be God just simply keeping us in check so that we trust in him. Remember, we're trying to become more like Jesus, and if he needs to give us a thorn in the flesh to keep us in check so that we trust in him to become more like Jesus, then that's what we need. And second, when you look at this passage, he listened for God's message. I mean, 3 times he pleaded with God to take it away, but he's waiting, and he has no alternative, by the way. He's waiting to say, okay, God, what do you choose to do with this? And God said, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it because my power is made perfect in weakness. And like Jesus in the garden, Paul, he accepted that it was God's will, and then He depended on God's grace. You know, my grace is sufficient for you. Paul, the way that I operate in your life is sufficient for you. That is all that you need. And man, what a great lesson for us to learn, just to have the contentment of letting God do in our lives what he needs to do, and to be receptive to that will, and to be content in that will. So he recognized the thorn as a gift. He listened for God's message. He accepted God's will. He depended on God's grace, and then he experienced strength out of weakness. You know, and when we get down to that other section, you know, he says, that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. And here's the kicker: for when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. When I depend on God, then I have strength. When I depend on God, that's when God can really use me. When I think I can do it all by myself, or I'm conceited, that's when God can use me the very least. So we're back to our primary lesson tonight, okay? The more we recognize our weakness, the more God can use us. The more we recognize our weakness, the more God can use us. You know, you could reverse that and say, the more we become confident in our own ability, the less God can use us. The more we become confident in our own ability, the less God can use us. The more we recognize our weakness, the more God can use us. Philip Brooks made this statement one time. He said, "Do not pray for easy lives. Pray to be better men and women. Do not ask for tasks equal to your powers. Ask for powers equal to your task." Man, that is a great statement. You know, what if instead of asking for tasks equal to our powers, we all ask for powers equal to the task that God has placed on our hearts? Paul's vision and his thorn. And weakness works for us, not against us, because of the strength of God's Spirit which lives in us. Weakness works for us, not against us, because of the strength of God's Spirit which lives in us. So the paradoxical teaching is, in weakness, then we become strong, and in strength, we become weak. Hey, thanks for joining in. I hope you enjoyed that. It's a really cool paradoxical teaching. We'll be streaming again Sunday morning at 9 o'clock for Bible class. We're looking at the Beatitudes, and then we'll be streaming live service Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. If you do not have a church home and you live close to us, within 100 miles, drive and join us on Sunday morning. If you can't do that and you don't have the ability to find a church to worship with, or, maybe you are homebound or taking care of somebody who's homebound, please join us Sunday morning and worship with us online. I hope you have a great evening, and I'll see you on the live stream Sunday morning.